Thank you very much, Ema. So it's great to be here. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know you have exams and things to worry about. I'm Jeff Skier, as just said, and I've been working with the International Renewable Energy Agency for about 5 years. And the last couple of years, I've been focusing on bioenergy, particularly sustainable bioenergy potential, cost-effective bioenergy pathways, and increasingly we are thinking about effective scale-up strategies for bioenergy. Before I introduce IRENA, could I ask perhaps for a show of hands in the room, like how many people are here because they think bioenergy is a good option? How many are in the room because they think there's problems with bioenergy? And how many people are still deciding? Okay, so about half of people raise their hands altogether, so I guess it's a mix. I hope that after this lecture you'll be a little bit better informed and to make a better informed decision about your views on bioenergy. I hope that when you came in, you picked up this nice briefing paper that IRENA prepared with the IEA Bioenergy Technology Cooperation Program and also with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, which makes a number of points that I'll refer to in the course of the lecture. And the 4-page briefing paper is called Bioenergy for Sustainable Development. It's available online, and of course there are copies out front. Some of you might have forgotten, not to worry, they'll still be there when you leave. And I hope that you've also picked up freshly printed copies of Boosting Biofuels, Sustainable Paths to Greater Energy Security, which has some of the points that I'll be summarizing in the lecture, although not all of them. Just a little bit about IRENA. IRENA was established in 2011, not very long ago. We're just a little over 6 years old. And our mission is to accelerate the deployment of renewable energy. We already have 153 full-fledged members, with another 27 in a state of accession, on our way to becoming practically universal. And we're dedicated to accelerating the sustainable deployment of all renewable energy sources: wind, solar, ocean, hydro, geothermal, and my current favorite, bioenergy. By way of introduction, I'll just perhaps summarize a few points first that are contained in the briefing paper on sustainable bioenergy, and then you'll perhaps hear about some more about those points later on. One of the key points is that bioenergy is an essential part of sustainable development, and it will be hard to meet climate goals without it. And the reason for that is that, in fact, bioenergy makes up a large share of the cost-effective options for increasing renewable energy use. And a second important point that's made in the briefing paper is that bioenergy has a role to play in every energy sector. In the power sector for flexibility, to balance wind and solar, in process heat and materials for industry, in heating systems and stoves for buildings, and fuels for transport. Sometimes we tend to think of biofuels as just being liquid transportation fuels, but it's a lot more. It's also heat and power and includes just the use of wood, for example. We emphasize that biofuels are, however, the only practical current alternative to fossil fuels for certain types of transportation, particularly aviation. It's hard to imagine planes being electrified, for example. And a third important point on the brief, which I'll be illustrating in the course of this lecture, relates to opportunities and challenges. Bioenergy enhances energy access and reduces reliance on fossil fuels, which is an important part of mitigating climate change. But there's a lot of skepticism, and including in this room, I'm sure, because there's concerns about food security, land use change that may increase carbon emissions or reduce biodiversity, and and making bioenergy economically competitive. So we try to think about ways of producing bioenergy that do not hinder food security, do not cause land use change, and that are cost effective. And I'd also like to stress that really bioenergy is important for meeting a variety of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals: climate change action, food security, sustainable land use, and access to affordable, reliable, and modern sustainable energy for all, often called C for all. Here's a picture of the environmental challenge that faces us. Probably you've seen this sort of thing before. It's really going to be very challenging to keep global warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade. This, of course, was a large part of the discussion in Bonn during the COP23 in the last couple of weeks. How are we going to do this? And there were some news reports that we're not doing as well as we should be. We need to keep working. If you look at the chart, you can see the gray area on top shows the likely emission pathways with no new policies, which would lead to much greater global warming. The gold area below that shows the likely emissions pathway if all the current policies, pledges, and nationally determined contributions, often called NDCs, are implemented. And that's still not nearly enough, since there would still be only a very low chance, just about 4%, of keeping global temperature rise below 2 degrees. So we have to do better. In the blue, lower down, we see much more ambitious pathways that are needed to bring the world in line with Paris. These would reduce emissions in the year 2050 by 80% from the policy case, roughly from 60 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year down to 10, a factor of 6. But even this very ambitious program of activity would just offer 2 chances out of 3 to limit temperature rise to 2 degrees, let alone to 1.5 degrees. So many people have also discussed an insurance policy in the form of negative technologies, such as bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or afforestation, which is just a natural form of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And they think that a lot of this might well be needed in the second half of the century. So here are some bar charts, a little simpler than the previous page. So in view of the environmental challenge and the environmental imperative, and the steadily declining costs of renewable energy, which probably you've heard a lot about, we see renewables in general becoming the largest primary energy source by taking market share away from fossil fuels, especially coal. And if you look at the picture here in 2050, we see the potential for renewables to supply nearly 2/3 of primary energy, as shown in the green bars. This is our favorite chart, which I call the donut chart. It's interesting to look at the donut hole as well as the donut. So the inner part, which is the donut hole, shows renewable energy use by sector. So we think that in 2050, we're going to need about 235 exajoules of renewable energy. That's just a standard unit, which is a lot of energy. Exa is 10 to the 18th power. A joule, of course, is a watt per second, so it's a large amount of energy, and 235 is a lot. And 44% would be needed for heat and other direct uses, about a little over 2/5. Another 40% for power, and a little less than 1/5, or 16%, for transport. So that's the inner sector. You see the electricity power needs in yellow, 40%, the heat and other direct uses in orange, 44%, and transport 16%. Of course, just an approximation. And in this remap vision, as we call it, renewable energy map, or remap, roughly 3/8 of the renewable energy supply would be some form of bioenergy. And here we can look at the green shaded areas in the outer donut. 10% would be for bioenergy in buildings, which you see kind of on the lower left. I'm supposed to use the pointer here. And then about 13% for bioenergy to provide industrial process heat, and biofuels for industry here. And 11% in the form of liquid biofuels for transport, so this is the bioethanol, the biodiesel, and about 3% for power. So that's just sort of introductory section. We were trying to figure out whether it made sense to keep all questions and answers for the end, or whether it might make sense to have some questions and answers at different points in the presentation. Of course, the more I present, the fewer questions you'll have, presumably. But if you have some questions about this introductory material, please feel free to ask. Sir?
How do you come up with this? Like, what is the basis? Let's say in 2050 you want this sector, this sector, this sector, this technology, the share you showed here, right on this slide. So what is the basis to come up with this step?
Okay, we have a modeling team. You asked what is the basis for these figures, and we have a modeling team that basically tries to look at all the different renewable energy options that could realistically be available by 2050. That's basically a very short way of describing it, and I probably can't give you a very satisfactory answer here, but you are welcome to talk with our team later if you want more details. Also, we have very extensive reports in the REMAP series, so I would suggest you go online and find those reports, because that will have a lot of detail about all the assumptions that were made. Sorry for not making a more comprehensive response, but it's a short lecture.
I see like it's 37% from biofuels.
Yes.
And bioenergy.
Yes.
I would say it's really optimistic.
Well, of course, this is all optimistic. This is not a business as usual scenario. It implies significant effort to move ahead. So, and that's the challenge. How do we get so much bioenergy? So I hope to suggest some possible ways. But it's not. There's no guarantees, right? We have to take action to get there. So the second part of my remarks relates to the question that you just asked, really. Is there enough sustainable biomass to reach this kind of very ambitious goal? And it is indeed quite challenging. There are social challenges, environmental challenges, and economic challenges, the three key dimensions of sustainability. The reputation and prospects of bioenergy have suffered from at least three major blows. First, the concern over food versus fuel production has called into question the social sustainability. Second, concern over land use change has called into question the environmental sustainability. And most recently, the low price of oil, caused in part by the previous use of bioenergy for transport fuels, which has softened the world price of oil, has called into question the economic sustainability. Luckily, there are ways to expand bioenergy production without reducing food supplies, without reducing sequestration of carbon, and without competing with oil. And the main underlying principle which is also in the sustainability brief, is what we call sustainable intensification of agriculture. Basically, higher yields, growing more food on the same land, so that, in principle, you could make land available for energy crops without requiring additional land for these crops. And in terms of economic, which I'll detail quite a bit later, in terms of economics, it's also important to understand that while oil competes with liquid biofuels for transport, these liquid biofuels actually account for just about a quarter of the projected bioenergy needs. The other 3/4 are for cooking and for heat and power. And there's a great potential there to improve the health and reduce emissions of carbon and other pollutants by making bioenergy use more efficient and clean. So we think that if better health and reduced emissions, both of carbon dioxide and traditional pollutants, are properly valued in the marketplace, bioenergy should be able to compete. And what are some pockets of sustainable bioenergy? As I said, quite a lot can be obtained without reducing food supplies or emitting carbon dioxide. As noted in the brief, sustainable intensification and landscape planning, increasing output per unit of land while maintaining or improving ecosystems' health and productive capacity, can make substantial amounts of land available for bioenergy crops, like high-yielding, rapidly growing trees and grasses, and so can restoring degraded land and reducing losses in the food chain. Residues from food and lumber production and from cities are another pocket of potential. And now let me talk about those different pockets in a little more detail. Excuse me. This is one of my favorite charts. This is called the yield gap chart. This is for maize, but if you go to the data and the Global Agricultural Economic Zones, which is prepared by a Food and Agriculture Organization, they have this information for every crop. And what you can see on this chart, I don't know what the colors are looking like out there, but basically the dark green is Europe. And the dark green areas are where you're getting over 70% of the potential. This is adjusted for climate and rainfall and things like that. You're getting a very high percentage of your potential yield. In the United States, which is not quite as advanced as Europe, which has surprised me as an American because we're known for how much maize we produce in Iowa, it's also pretty high, 55 to 70% in the light green. But if you go to, for example, Africa or India in the light brown, basically they're just getting 10% to 25% of their potential yields. So in theory, they could double or triple or quadruple their yields if they just did the right things, if they had the right skills and they had the right kinds of seed and the right techniques. So there's a lot of potential for sustainable intensification, and I can't show every crop, but this is an interesting crop because it's a food staple in much of the world. But on average, FAO projects that the global average yield for major food crops will grow from a little over 4 tons per hectare in 2010 to a little over 5 tons per hectare in 2050. But the potential yield is over 10 tons per hectare. So the projected yield is 5 and the potential yield is 10, so it's not very difficult math to say that if the yield gap could be closed, just about half as much land would be needed for food. So that creates a lot of potential land for growing a bioenergy crop. Okay. And we think that an important policy approach here is agricultural extension services. Development agencies can provide information and training to farmers to promote modern farming techniques. And also, if we have secure land tenure for the farmers, they will have the financial incentives to manage their land to get higher yields and keep the soil productive. Another aspect of using land more intensively relates to pasture land. This picture shows in orange the cropland on the right, and in green the pasture land on the left. And the pasture land is almost evenly divided between really good land, which is called prime land, and not so great land, which is called marginally and very marginal land, in light green. But you'll note that the dark green area of the good pasture land is almost as large as the amount of cropland. But you can also see, looking at the line part, the line shows what percentage of the dietary protein is provided by this land, and actually only 3% is grown of the world's food is produced on the pasture land, while 97% is produced on the cropland. Now, of course, this is due in part to people eating meat, but we're not a dietary or nutrition agency, so we don't talk about that. What we do note, however, is that there are ways to produce livestock for meat and milk products much more efficiently. And we know, for example, that in Brazil, they've been able to grow, instead of just having the animals graze on the land, they can use a portion of the land to grow crops with a much higher yield and feed the animal with that feed, feed the livestock with that feed, and then they have land left over for other things. That approach, in fact, has been documented to have reduced substantially the rate of encroachment on rainforest in Brazil, and we hope that this kind of approach can continue to make progress so that we won't see further degradation of rainforest in Brazil, which we know is very harmful not only to biodiversity and local livelihoods, but of course to the global potential for sequestering carbon. So we think that the pasture land intensification is quite a nice thing to consider as well. Now, let me go on to the potential from reducing food waste. You might know that according to the Food and Agricultural Organization, about 1/3 of the food that is produced for human consumption is lost or wasted. So we thought it would be quite interesting to think about how much less could be wasted and how much land could be made available for bioenergy crops if the best practices around the world at each stage of the food chain were adopted in every region. So there's different food groups here: cereals, roots and tubers, oil seeds and pulses, fruits and vegetables, meat and milk. Of course, fruits and vegetables are particularly perishable. Meat and milk are also quite perishable, so in general you have higher losses for these, but what's shown here are the losses in the region that does best at each stage. You have the stage of agricultural production, you have the stage of post-harvest handling and storage, you have the stage of processing and packaging, then you have distribution and the supermarket, and finally consumption is what's called waste. After people buy the food, they may not eat all of it. What's interesting here is that there's no one region that does best in all these areas. In fact, it's very interesting to note the consumption losses are very low in Africa. In a way, it's not surprising. A relatively poor region, people can't afford to waste food once they buy it. And then the lowest production losses happen to be achieved in industrialized parts of Asia, like Japan. And post-harvest handling and storage losses are lowest in North America. So if we're able to share the best practices around the world, we think there's quite large opportunities to reduce the amount of food that's lost or wasted. And if you don't lose or waste it, you don't need to grow it, because you don't need the land to grow it, and potentially, at least in theory, you could grow some bioenergy crops on that land. We thought, well, how do you get this to happen? And if you think about it, there are actually a number of measures that could help reduce food losses and waste, so that part of this potential could be realized. One set of measures relates to developing countries. In these countries, we think it's important to look at things like improved harvesting techniques, storage and cooling facilities, and better packaging to reduce food spoilage, and transportation infrastructure to bring more food to market while it remains fresh. So extension services and capacity building could help improve harvesting techniques, and also local health regulation could require better packaging. And one of our favorite options is small-scale solar power systems to help provide refrigeration. So there's renewable technologies, even if they're not connected to the power grid, which can provide refrigeration, and they can store their perishable food, and they can store their perishable medicines. At the same time, if you build better roads, the food gets to market faster and it doesn't spoil as much. So there's a lot of things you can do to help developing countries. And as an added bonus, which is probably not even the main reason you're doing it, you open up some land potentially for growing bioenergy crops, like wood crops, which would prevent the need for people to go spend hours every week going to the forest and depleting it. Another set of measures is probably useful for developed countries, where the main problem is not losses at the earlier stage of the food chain, but the waste after the food is purchased. And one thing you can do is to have different prices to encourage sale of food that's not perfect. So if it's not perfect, you just lower the price and people will still buy it. You can also modify the labels. There's been a lot of discussion about the best buy dates and the best before dates. You may have noticed that a lot of food is good for many days or even weeks after the expiration date. So if the information is presented in a better way, less food will be thrown away. And also, some of the problem is regulatory. It may be that you need regulations to allow the sale of lower quality food items that are still healthy. And probably the food retailers, Rewe and others, can make food labels more informative. And the food producers and processors can do advertising to change consumer attitudes so they don't waste as much. Okay. Finally, we'd like to go on to talk about the potential of restoring degraded land. This is Bonn. So perhaps some of you have heard about something called the Bonn Challenge. This, combined with the subsequent New York Declaration, have committed countries to restore 350 million hectares of land by 2030. This is restoring degraded land that is not in productive use or is not producing as much as it could. And here we've sort of illustrated part of that Bonn Challenge effort, which is called the African Forest Landscape Restoration Initiative, or just AFR 100. And this was launched at COP21 in Paris. And this aims to restore 100 million of these hectares. That's why it's called AFR 100. And it has already been joined by something like 18 countries, although we've just showed 15 in this particular chart. There's ways to promote restoration of degraded land. And a very important factor, as I mentioned earlier, is secure land tenure, so that this will allow the harvest and the sale of food and fuel produced on the land. And it's also helpful to have information to farmers and smallholders on climate-specific, soil-specific production systems, which can help them do the best with this land. Okay, and if you add it all up, a theoretical potential exists for over 2 billion hectares of land to become available for growing solid biomass. In my next presentation, probably I should have a way of comparing this to the size of a continent. It's a very large amount of land. If you assume very modestly a yield of 10 tons per hectare and an energy content of 15 gigajoules per ton, which is very technical, but 10 tons per hectare is a very modest yield for a wood crop or a grass crop. This would equate to over 300 exajoules of biomass. And you'll note that in the donut chart, we were talking about 37% of 235, which is about 87. So we've got at least 3 times as much potential just from using land better than we have a need for additional bioenergy by the year 2050. So, and another way of looking at it is that this is, if it were to develop such a large amount of bioenergy, the 300 exajoules, this would be more than enough to displace all of the petroleum currently used for transportation fuel. So it's a big potential. Surprise, that's not all. There's even other potential. And that potential in particular is provided by residues, farm residues and agricultural and forest residues. As food production expands to meet the growing population of the world, it stands to reason there will also be more crop residues. So if you grow more corn, you have more corn husks. If you grow more wheat, you have more wheat straw. Some of that is needed to feed animals or keep the soil in good shape, but the rest can be used for energy, and we've kind of analyzed that very carefully. Similarly, as you expand the wood production from the forest to meet growing demand for lumber, which, by the way, is a very helpful thing because it stores carbon in buildings and furniture, there's growing amounts of other wood that's left over. It could be just left on the floor of the forest, or it could be burned in a modern, efficient combined heat and power plant and displace fossil fuels. Sustainable management can keep forests growing while more wood is extracted. In fact, if you look at most of Northern Europe, very consistently over the last century, far less than the amount of annual growth in the forest mass has been harvested. This means the forest mass has been constantly increasing, and therefore the carbon sequestration of the forest has been increasing, and the potential to extract lumber and energy wood from the forest has been increasing as well. Also, we can note that modern cook stoves, which are 2 or 3 times as efficient as traditional cook stoves that are used in most developing countries, could conserve a lot of biomass, making it available as supply for other uses. And of course, we don't even count in our analysis the additional food and construction waste from cities. So that's a further increment. Let me focus a little bit on forests and wood. I think it's quite interesting to talk about in Germany, because I don't know how many of you know, I was certainly very surprised to discover that something like 8 million home furnaces in Germany use wood. And they're very efficient, apparently 80% or 90% efficient. So I think it's quite an interesting option. I'm going to talk a little bit about 2 types of models. One is a planted forest model, and one is a short rotation model, which is more like planting wood on farms. The first model, the planted forest model, which has been very successfully applied in Northern Europe and North America, this is based upon the long-term nurturing of planted forests. We're not talking about pristine forests that have never been touched. First of all, it's not a good idea to touch them, and second of all, there are no roads going there, so you can't really very practically touch them. And third of all, you have a lot of other forests that are closer and easier to manage. We're talking about forests that have been planted for years or decades and actively managed. Usually there's a very strong land tenure, so the foresters, the owners of the forest, which are sometimes government agencies and sometimes private parties, have the incentive to plant more trees on the same land and to harvest them for long-lasting, high-value uses. And most of the wood is not burned for energy, at least right away. Actually, there's an economic incentive not to burn the wood for energy if you could possibly use it for something else. Because lumber, what's used to build these desks and this lectern, it's much more valuable, and it fetches something like typically 8 or 10 times as much per ton as energy would. So of course nobody's going to burn it if it's so valuable. It could be sold for much more money. This lumber goes to build not only furniture, which I'm sure lasts for many, many years here at the university, but also can be used in building construction. There are ways to have fire-safe wood and displace cement, which is much more carbon intensive. So actually, by using this lumber, you're reducing the carbon in the building stock. And so it's not, when you cut down the tree in the forest, the carbon is not released. What's happening is that much of that carbon, much of that wood goes into a home or a building or furniture and continues to store carbon for many years. Some of it goes into paper or pulp and stores the carbon for a few years, a little bit is left over, or even perhaps as much as half, and you basically have a choice of leaving it on the floor of the forest and eventually rot and become carbon dioxide, or burning it in an efficient plant still releases carbon dioxide, not any more than would have been released anyway, but may in fact displace quite a bit of natural gas, imported natural gas from Russia, for example. It may displace a lot of use of coal in certain countries, and it could also displace the use of oil in places that have small diesel generators. So, meanwhile, after you cut down the tree, it's in your interest as a forester to plant additional trees, and these will sequester additional carbon, and actually the new trees grow faster than the old trees. So doing all these things, and then burning the residues in highly efficient combined heat and power plants and district heating systems and home furnaces, you're displacing a lot of carbon emissions and also sequestering a lot of additional carbon. Okay, so that's a basic picture of what can go on in a mature, well-managed forest in a well-regulated northern country with very clear property rights and legal systems. What do you do in a more developed country setting where perhaps property rights are not as clear and perhaps people are not as willing to make investments over the course of decades but really need to have a return quickly? And here we suggest a different model, a short rotation model. High-yielding tree species like Gliricidia and Acacia, Gliricidia is a word I just learned a year ago, but it's now one of my favorites for reasons you'll soon understand. These high-yielding wood crops can be grown together with food crops in an agroforestry approach. The key is really that these are nitrogen-fixing crops. So they naturally fertilize the soil and double or more than double the yields of the food crops next to them. So you saw the chart earlier of the maize, where in Africa and India they're getting maybe 15% of the potential yield. If you plant Gliricidia next to the maize, as I've done with 200,000 farmers in Zambia, you can get, in alternating rows, you more than double the yield of the maize. So even though you're only planting maize on 50% of the land, you get more maize than before, but you also get a lot of wood. And basically it's done in such a way that you cut down the wood every year, just as the rainy season begins and the corn growing season begins. So during the season that the corn has to grow, the plants are not blocked, the sun is not blocked from reaching the plants by the wood crop. So it's all a very nicely managed system, and you're able to greatly increase the efficiency of the land. And at the same time, you have wood available locally, and the women and children don't have to spend, apparently they typically spend 5 hours a week in many countries looking for wood. And that wood may not be there for many years because it's coming from forests that are not sustainably harvested. So something has to be done. And if they can combine that with modern cook stoves, which are much more efficient and much less smoky, there'll be much better health. I mean, there's many millions of people die each year from smoke inhalation in these countries. So this is a very promising practice as well. Now, this is a rather complicated chart. I'm not sure how much time really to spend on it. But basically, if you put all the options together that I've been discussing, the options made available from growing more bioenergy on land that's been freed by more efficient use of land and the other things I mentioned, and also the residues. And it's explained in details in the Boosting Biofuels book. Basically, you have a potential for theoretical biomass potential of over 500 exajoules. We calculate a stretch goal of about half of that, which is 287 exajoules. Anyway, I think, unless you force me to, I won't go through all these details, but this is available on the web. It all kind of adds up. And some of these potentials are readily used for combined heat and power, and others are more readily used for liquid biofuels. But an important point is that actually they can displace a lot of the transport fuel needs, or alternatively, they can displace a lot of the needs for industrial process heat and produce them from renewable fuels rather than from fossil fuels. So, there is a lot of biomass potential, but how quickly can it be mobilized? How can we get land use planning to encourage the kind of sustainable intensification that I've been discussing in our farms and our forests? How can we get the logistics in place to assemble the next necessary feedstocks at scale? So the next section of my remarks I'll be talking about conversion pathways and costs, but I guess I've covered quite a lot of ground here talking about the different resource potentials. So if somebody has an urgent question or something I can clarify, I'd certainly be happy to do that. Great. So sorry. Yes.
I'm wondering, if you use all the residues in wood, what about the ecosystems there? You need some kind of energy and nutrients to keep an ecosystem alive. For example, in Germany, woods, we only use part of what we cut down from the tree because the ecosystem needs some of the wood and some of the nutrients.
Yes.
You get out to the great ecosystem.
Correct. So the question is, what about the ecosystem? Don't you need some of the residues on the farm and some of the residues in the forest to keep the ecosystem healthy? And that's very true. We actually assume that no more than 50% of the residue on farms is available for use. We assume that at least 50% is needed typically 50% is needed to keep the soil healthy, 25 to 50%. The rest is available for use, and a lot of the use is for feeding animals, for example, so we subtract that as well and figure out how much would be left. But that assumes you're harvesting it all, and that's very difficult because it's in many different places and it's hard to guarantee. We know a lot of it is left on the ground or even burned in many places. In the case of forests, we hear from our friends in Quebec that there's a lot of what they call unloved wood, because you have these basically small branches, and the very small branches and leaves can be eventually integrated into the soil, but then you have other branches which are a little bit larger. They're not good enough for producing the kinds of nice tables we have in the room, and so they don't have much value, so very often they're not even collected, so they just sit there and rot. And we think there's a potential to collect some more of that and produce some energy. So, yeah.
The problem with that is that this rotting process is what keeps the forest alive. So all the beetles there, in Germany, over 500 beetle kinds which only live by rotting wood. So if you take out all the rotting wood, you destroy essentially the living ground for those beetles and the living ground for the birds which prey on them. And the other effects which these birds have on, for example, our neighboring agriculture to the forest. So it's a cascade. I don't think you can use all of the wood. You need to leave a little bit behind.
Well, as I said, that we assume that a lot of the wood, at least half the wood, is left in the forest. So we hope that, and this is just a very abstract analysis, and it's not precise, and of course it varies in each specific circumstance, which we haven't had the time to analyze yet. But in principle, we understand the need to leave some wood in the forest to grow the insects and things that birds feed upon. And this issue actually comes up as well in pasture land. Aren't you, if you are intensifying pasture land and instead of just letting animals graze casually, are you somehow reducing the biodiversity? We found that actually, in many cases, what you're doing when you intensify pasture land is not necessarily very good land, and so a lot of this land is not very biodiverse in the first place. So by introducing a new crop, you may actually be increasing the biodiversity, or at least turning it from a very, almost like a desert type of land to something more productive. So obviously we have to be very careful about the way we do this, but we're just trying to get a rough sense of what the potential might be if we were to collect all the wood. We're far from the point of collecting all the wood. In fact, probably we leave a lot more there than we need to sustain the local ecosystem. That's a general view. Obviously, in a specific circumstance, you could argue that they're collecting too much or collecting too little. My sense is that we don't have too much of an ecological problem at present because it's just not very valuable. You know, basically, when they cut down the wood for lumber, they're just, the stuff that isn't of high enough quality to make the lumber is simply just left there as unloved wood. So the question, which is a valid question, is how much more of that could you collect in a sustainable way? So I don't think we're going to resolve that here, but thank you for raising that issue, which is a very important one, and we do understand that we can't collect all the wood in the forest. So let me maybe go on to the next section now about conversion pathways and costs. How much you can collect will depend upon what cost-effective pathways we have available to convert different feedstocks to biofuel, because advanced biorefineries will enable us to use a broader range of feedstocks, including the woods and the grasses, to make biofuel. And what is cost-effective will depend also, in large part, on the value of carbon in the marketplace as the world works to keep the global warming well below 2 degrees centigrade. So actually, we were so bold as to try to measure the carbon benefits of biofuels in a very specific circumstance. And basically our analysis shows that the carbon emissions can be sharply reduced by shifting to liquid biofuels, especially if the biofuels are produced from sustainable feedstocks on existing farmlands or existing managed forests. And that's a very important condition, because this means that there's no greenhouse gas emissions arising from land use change. So all the things I've been discussing are options that in principle are things that can be done without reducing food consumption, without opening up additional lands. That's the entire point. We're trying to figure out what we can do without causing land use change. So this chart shows in gray the fossil gasoline or petrol and fossil diesel. And then we have, as alternatives to petrol, we have conventional ethanol from maize, conventional ethanol from sugarcane, and cellulosic ethanol, an advanced processed through hydrolysis of wood or straw. And then competing with fossil diesel, we have conventional biodiesel from soybean, conventional biodiesel from rapeseed grown in Europe, let's say, and conventional cellulosic biodiesel produced through a Fischer-Tropsch process. And we show particular different emissions associated with cultivation in green, processing in yellow, and transport in red. And so basically the issue here is, so you can see in this chart, and the gray bars are showing that the fossil fuels emit about 80 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per megajoule. Conventional biofuels emit much less. In case of maize ethanol, about half as much. And in the case of sugarcane ethanol, about a third as much as the gray bar petrol from fossil sources. And advanced biofuels, such as ethanol from hydrolysis and fermentation of wood, or cellulosic biodiesel, just produce about a third of the carbon dioxide emission, a quarter of the carbon dioxide emissions of conventional. So what does that mean, in fact? So first we try to figure out what that means in terms of the costs today. If you're looking at the current situation, with a carbon price very low, just $6 US dollars per ton of carbon equivalent, and an oil price, well, in this chart, $43 per barrel. It's gone up a little bit. The carbon price doesn't have much impact. Oil prices are near their cyclical lows, and the biofuels just can't compete with the fossil fuels. So you have in blue, you have the cellulosic biodiesel and cellulosic ethanol, and you can see the prices are just much higher than the prices of conventional biofuels, and very much higher than fossil fuels. So roughly speaking, the conventional biofuels in orange cost about twice as much, or more than twice as much as the conventional fossil fuels, and the advanced biofuels, shown in blue, about 4 times as much. So it doesn't look very promising. But maybe looking ahead, if oil prices go up a little bit and the carbon value of carbon goes up a lot, let's say, for argument's sake, up to $80 a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, the picture looks rather different. So here again, the same sort of visual dynamic. We're assuming different oil price projections, sort in the gray. You can't really see it very well. There's a dark gray area on top and a light gray area on the bottom, and in the middle is a mid-price projection. So basically, we look at projections by the U.S. Energy Information Administration, and they assume oil prices are at the bottom, $48 a barrel, and in a reference case, more like $117 a barrel. We think probably the low oil price case is the most interesting right now, because oil prices prospects look very weak with electric vehicles coming in, many people are thinking. And so with the low oil prices, when the carbon value is taken into account, the conventional biofuels shown in orange are roughly competitive with fossil fuels. So the lower bound of the gray, this is the low oil price case, and you can see the conventional biofuels are lower than that. And then even the advanced biofuels are kind of in a cost competitive range. At least in the reference case, which is the middle of the gray bar, higher oil prices combined with a higher carbon value put the advanced biofuels roughly in a cost competitive range. So we think there's at least a reasonable chance that you could have cost competitive biofuels. I'll skip over. This is just a different way of looking at the same thing, so I think I'll just skip over that. And this shows the technology status of different advanced liquid biofuel pathways. Some are still at the research stage or the prototype stage, but others are in the demonstration stage or ready for commercialization. So these pathways are promising, and we think the cost will go down quite substantially. But to develop the potential fully, we will need to have policies in place to get investment in kinds of pilot programs of commercial scale. Obviously, the first plant is going to be very expensive, and the second plant is going to be quite a bit less expensive. It may take until the fourth or fifth plants until you have a really good idea of what your costs typically will be for additional plants. So probably there's interesting models to explore for public-private cost sharing of the research, development, and demonstration efforts that are needed to move forward on these plant designs. Okay, and then finally I will talk a little bit about markets. We need to have a kind of market environment that will provide the support that biofuels and bioenergy require if we expect to have significant use. And really, the markets are very complex and varied. They require that consumers be actively engaged, that producers and marketers navigate a complex political setting, that they meet the technical demands of different transport modes, and that they adopt the economic and development status of different regions. Adapt to the status of different regions. So let's just talk a little bit about each of those 4 factors. First, the consumer setting. On the consumer side, biofuel markets require a lot more active engagement than other renewable energy sources. For example, if you look at the recent growth of the wind and solar power, you can see that it was quite simplified by the fact that consumers could just keep plugging in their electric appliances as usual, and all the complex work of balancing supply and demand minute by minute and second by second could be done by the highly skilled technical planners and operators, some of them with traditional utility companies, some with solar cell providers. But with biofuels, consumers must actively choose to buy a biofuel-capable vehicle. Unless biofuels enter the market through fossil fuel blending mandates, which is in fact the biggest market for liquid biofuels at present. Or if automobile manufacturers are required to make vehicles fuel flexible. In the case of Brazil, for example, you have very, very high ethanol blends. You have long-standing government policy for decades to promote domestic production of ethanol from sugarcane, and you have cars that have to be fuel flexible so they can be almost entirely run on ethanol. So that's on the consumer side. Politically, it won't surprise you to see that it's very complicated. Biofuels face a lot of challenges that other renewable energy forms don't. They have to satisfy government ministries and the people they represent and the stakeholders in all these different spheres: energy, environment, agriculture, forestry, and development, and also planning. In the energy sector, biofuels are competing with fossil fuel production, so that's a big political lift in certain countries where a lot of oil and gas is produced, or a lot of coal is produced, or used to be produced, and leaders think it's still an important source of jobs, incorrectly in our view. In terms of the environment, as already discussed, the biofuels run into concerns about impacts on land use, greenhouse gas emissions, and biodiversity. In agriculture, they raise concerns about how they will impact farming and farming practices. In forestry, they raise concerns about how they might make forests smaller, although we know that, in fact, boreal forests, the northern forests, have grown steadily as their output has increased. So I hope you enjoyed the lecture. Biofuels further raise development concerns about impacts on nutritional well-being and livelihoods in developing countries. And all of these concerns, we think, can be addressed by sustainable practices, but they have to be addressed. Otherwise, the development of biofuel markets will be really slowed by political pressures from all directions. And also, might further point out that biofuel development requires interaction at subnational level with urban and regional planning authorities, which are responsible for land use and transport. And then, above the level of national governments, we have two sectors that typically shipping and aviation, which are international, which require regulatory approvals from international organizations. So anyway, in view of all this political complexity, we think that promotion of bioenergy, if we decide to promote it to meet the 3/8 of renewable energy needs in 2050, this has to be elevated to the highest levels of political decision making. And clearly it is not just an energy issue. And then a third area which we notice that transport markets differ by mode of transport. And the key here is energy density. Heavier modes require greater energy density, and really only liquid biofuels can provide this, unless you do something very special. In aviation, which accounts for about 10% of global transport demand, it's really hard to see liquid fuels ever being entirely replaced, although we do hear that if the cost of batteries were, battery energy density were improved by 2 or 3 orders of magnitude, let's say by a factor of 100 or more, or 1,000, eventually by the year 2040 or something, you could imagine short-haul passenger flights up to 800 kilometers electric. I'm not holding my breath. In any case, a lot of air traffic is, a very large part of air traffic is for longer flights, and liquid fuels will continue to be needed. But you may have noticed a lot of talk this year about electric vehicles, and these continue to make rapid inroads because you basically have had Better batteries, which allow a greater range at a reasonable cost without too much weight gain. You're seeing the market for electric vehicles expand, and there's now a couple of million electric vehicles, and we think will eventually be over 10 million sold a year. Better batteries will be supported by faster, more flexible charging options and smart grids that allow consumers to charge their cars when the rates are lowest. So probably you'll have a large inroads in light passenger traffic, but it'd be a little bit tougher for road freight and marine ships. Although we do hear there's interesting options, for example, on German highways to electrify them by having overhead electric lines like trams have on certain streets. But in any case, as I said, very hard to electrify air traffic. So we think that for quite some time, we're going to have a substantial market for regular vehicles and also biofuels, but it varies by sector. A lot of the growth in biofuels so far, as I mentioned, has been driven by blending mandates and the ability of biofuels to improve the performance of conventional fuels. Actually, if you put a few percent bioenergy, bioethanol in your petrol, it improves the performance quite a lot. So that's the big bang for incentive for the blenders. And as long as most cars are driven by internal combustion engines, these blending mandates will support conventional biofuels. But as light transport is electrified and the market focuses more on jet fuel, we may see a tendency to upgrade biofuels from conventional crops, such as sugar, corn, and oil palm, and a greater push for drop-in fuels we call from lignocellulosic feedstocks like wood and straw, depending upon which options are most cost-effective. So we think this is sort of a renewable transport vision for 2050. We think the transport will become much more electrified over time. We see perhaps 30% of energy for transport could be electric by 2050. With 1.3 billion electric vehicles, a dramatic expansion by over a factor of roughly 1,000 from 1.5 million in 2016. At the same time, the transport market is a very large market. There could also be an eightfold increase in liquid biofuels. You could have a big market for sustainable bioenergy in transport along with a big market for electric vehicles. But there's a lot of regional variance. You can just imagine things happen in different ways in different places. In Brazil, where they've got all this low-cost sugarcane feedstock and a long history of fuel-flexible vehicles, there's no particular reason to think that biofuels for passenger transport will be displaced by electric vehicles. Why should they? They're doing very well. In Africa and South Asia, on the other hand, you have very poorly developed power grids. It could be a few decades before the electricity infrastructure is reliable enough and large enough to support a major expansion of electric vehicles in those places. And in those places, it could well be that the biofuel blending mandates could be quite strong because, as I said, they improve the performance of the conventional fuels. Anyway, the initial shift towards electric vehicles is likely to be mostly in the industrialized countries of the OECD, starting with Europe and North America. So that is most of my points, but I have a few conclusions. Renewable energy solutions are key to transport, whether they're renewable inputs like wind and solar and bioenergy to electric vehicles, whether they're as biofuels for light vehicles as electric vehicles phase in, or whether they're as biofuels for heavy freight, marine shipping, and aviation. It's important to develop advanced liquid biofuel technologies that can use wood and straw because this will diversify the range of sustainable feedstocks. And these sorts of advanced biofuels should become cost-effective if we step up and make the investment required in commercial scale pilot plants. As I mentioned at the outset, We've developed this nice paper for bioenergy for sustainable development. I hope you'll take a few minutes to read it. We spent many weeks trying to make it very short. So, as you know, it takes a long time to write a short thing. And there's some nice suggestions for additional reading at the end. And we welcome you to explore our website and other social media sites for the wealth of information available from IRENA. That concludes my formal remarks, and I'd be very happy to respond to further questions. But please wait for Sean to bring you the microphone, because we're recording this, and there's this very special operation.
First of all, thank you very much. I have just a question about a graph that we have seen in the third part. It was about the CO2 emission savings for different, yeah, exactly. I'm just wondering why for conventional ethanol sugarcane and for conventional biodiesel soybean, we have higher transport CO2 emission savings.
Is the question why there is no red part for certain?
No, why those two kinds of biofuel have higher CO2 emission savings due to transport compared to other ones?
Yeah, I actually can't remember exactly why, but I think it has to do with assumptions about how far the shipping is typically between the place where the crops are grown and the place where the crops are used. I guess in the case of rapeseed, it's typically grown in Europe and used in Europe. In the case of corn, also maize, typically, let's say, grown in the United States and converted to corn ethanol in the United States. So in that sense, less of a transport cost, perhaps. And then I imagine that in the case of, for example, sugarcane ethanol, it may be that quite a bit is exported. You may get exports from Brazil to the United States and things like that. But actually, I would advise you, if you're really interested in the complexities of this, to go a little bit further into our documentation. I think the basic carbon values are sort of listed in our study of advanced liquid biofuels, which is mostly focused on the cost of different conversion technologies and how the costs are coming down or should come down, but also has basic information about the carbon emissions. So happy to dialogue with you further on that. I mean, if you explore the detailed documentation and have further questions. Yeah. I think the young lady up here also wanted to ask a question. All the young ladies here are young, so it's not a very good differentiation.
Well, thank you also very much for your insightful lecture. So my question concerns your statement that there would be no additional land use required for the transition to biofuel, and I wanted to ask how this can be ensured, because I wondered how can a sustainable transition to bioenergy be ensured without initiating land grabs or affecting indigenous people or small farmers by major corporations who grab land, because I wonder how you in general want to integrate small farmers in the process of transitioning, and whether IRENA works together with other projects or agencies on such integration efforts.
So I think there's an environmental dimension to your question and also a social dimension. And I think perhaps in a way the social dimension is the most important. So if you look at agriculture in Africa and India, for example, we know that it's almost all in very small plots of land. And it's almost all, smallholders. Typical plot of land is less than a hectare. So, apart from the fact that land grabbing is undesirable, in fact, we face a situation with most of the land is in the hands of smallholders. And we have to assume that if that land is going to be used more productively, we have to, find ways of getting those smallholders, persuading those smallholders that it's a good idea. So we do think there's some nice models, and for one of them that I mentioned is this corn and glycidia model. So there's something called the Evergreen Initiative, which is associated with ICRAF, which is the World Agroforestry Center, and they're the people who have sort of persuaded 200,000 farmers in Zambia to adopt this technology because it obviously increases their livelihoods. And there's other cases with other crops. You may know about the neem seeds in India that can be used directly to make fuel for the farm equipment, which then enables the farms to be more productive. And you had a case where, let's say, the first village that adopted it, had great increase in prosperity, and then the next neighboring village figured it out and wanted the same thing. So basically, you have a word-of-mouth process that eventually gets others to adopt this, but every country is different. Imagine you have 1 hectare of land and it's your sole livelihood. It's going to take a lot to persuade you to do something different. Let's say you've been planting corn the same way. I'm American, so I call it corn, but it's maize. It's the same thing. You've been doing it the same way for decades, and your father did it this way, and your grandmother did it this way, and why should you change? And you think, well, if I change, maybe something will happen, and I won't have a crop this year. So we're trying to think of ways to cooperate with perhaps, development agencies that provide small grants, for example. So let's say do pilot projects in villages in different countries and say, look, here's what they did in Zambia. If we can have somebody living with them on the, there in the village, and sort of interacting with them on a regular basis and say, look, this is what they did in Zambia, and we can even maybe bring a farmer from Zambia to talk about it. I mean, I don't really know. This really worked for them. They increased their livelihoods. They had more corn than before. They have this wood crop. They can turn the wood to charcoal and sell it. So their income really increased. And we're trying to work with ICRAF to develop these sort of document these case success stories so that we can persuade more people about this. So that's a very basic approach. But I think there was also a first part of your question, which I can't quite recall. I didn't remember.
It was like how you can ensure that no land, that no additional land use isn't required in general.
Right. So that's very important too, because we're well aware of, what, from an environmental perspective, could be considered quite a disastrous experience in Indonesia, for example, where you have a very efficient plant called the oil palm, which unfortunately, instead of being planted on a farm, was planted in a rainforest or planted on a peat bog. So you had a lot of carbon sequestration going on in that rainforest or that peat bog, which stopped when you planted the oil palm. So it created a carbon deficit. It was a real problem. But in fact, the oil palm is producing a product which is in about half of all consumer products and is a very efficient tree. So the problem is not with the oil palm, the problem is with the governance system. So it's very important to answer your question to have governance which says that you're only allowed to plant this on agricultural land or perhaps grassland, not in rainforests. And this has to do with certification systems internationally and so forth. Personally, I'm not so sure how effective a European certification system is for enforcing behavior in Indonesia, because a lot of it is, as I said, not used for bioenergy. It's used for food crops. It's used for food products and detergents and things. And so it has to do with convincing, I think, each country that they need to step up and do the right thing. But in our analysis, we're assuming that that's in place, so we try to figure out, well, how much could you get, assuming we're not using any more land. So we haven't really gone into depth on all the steps that need to be taken to ensure that you're not using any additional land. But it's very important.
I just want to ask you first if biofuels are affordable in Africa, and also I wanted to ask you about the map you had, the remap 2050, the one you showed us. On geothermal, you have only 4%, and I was, wondering, in comparison to solar. I thought that was a very small figure. And then in your paper here, it says when you integrate bioenergy in the bioeconomy, you stated that it accounts for about $2 trillion per year in trade. That was quite a staggering figure, isn't it? I'm just wondering where you get your figures.
I mean, I think this number was supplied by one of our partners, but I'm sure they did a good analysis and added up all the value of food products and wood products and fisheries and things, all the products that are listed. It's not surprising that if you add together all these things, all the fibers, all the biomaterials, the chemicals and medicines, and food and paper, that this agroeconomy accounts for about 1/8 of global trade. It's not surprising to me. I can't give you the details offhand of how the number was calculated. In terms of the geothermal, I'm not really sure. I know my colleagues tried diligently to think about, how much could we get of each renewable energy source? We are supportive of each renewable energy source, and I suppose one could argue that there may be further, more optimistic assumptions they can make about how much geothermal energy could be developed by 2050. I'm not really sure, because I'm personally focusing on bioenergy. I think your most interesting question actually is whether biofuels are affordable in Africa. And I think it depends on how you're defining biofuels. If you're looking at liquid biofuels, we don't see big markets in Africa right now for liquid biofuels. But it's not to say there couldn't be. As Africa becomes more prosperous and more people have automobiles, let's say a lot of those are internal combustion engine automobiles, hopefully very efficient, fuel-efficient ones, but maybe especially in Western Africa, they don't have a very good power grid, so they're not going to have electric vehicles necessarily. There certainly could be options for them to be producing ethanol from sugarcane. There's a lot of countries in southern Africa, at least, I know, that produce sugarcane. They could be producing ethanol in much the way that Brazil is producing ethanol. Although it's a different situation, you have much smaller plots of land, and we're not necessarily saying that, the plots should be consolidated. I'm sure there are ways of producing ethanol in that context. But I think that if you define fuel more broadly to include wood fuel, that's very important for Africa. And I think wood fuel is not affordable, and that's why people are just going and searching for it in the local rainforest. It's not a sustainable thing. I don't think that was going to be available. So we think this agroforestry approach can be a very nice way that enables people to grow in addition to the food crop they're growing, also to grow a wood crop. And because it's like a magic type of wood crop, which is nitrogen fixing, the magic of Mother Nature, that this can actually be a great bonus for them. And then they won't have to spend a lot of time searching for wood, so they have extra time. Let's say the kids can spend more time studying, the women can have time to have an enterprise or even relax, God forbid. Then, they can have a wood supply for their cooking and for They can have a small charcoal maker and sell charcoal to the cities. And we know that charcoal is a very challenging thing in terms of sustainability, in terms of forests in Africa. So we think if people can grow biofuel, solid biofuel called wood, or use residues from their crops, also a solid biofuel, this can be a very good approach. I think it's not only affordable, but something that will greatly contribute to the livelihoods of people who pursue this option. Don't tell me you're all tired out. Well, if you have further questions, I'd be happy to answer them afterwards. I'm available on the internet. I think my address is there at the back of the briefing paper. So thank you very much on behalf of IRENA.